This is Chris Hedges, and you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David.
Hello, Steve.
And our industrious producer, Hannah Feldman.
Hello, Steve.
And the man of the hour, Ralph Nader.
Hello, everybody.
In the first half of today's program, we are going to open up the mailbag, and Ralph is going to answer some of your questions you have submitted. We have a lot of great questions coming in, and we're going to get to a few of them today. But we want you to keep submitting your questions for Ralph so that we can soon devote an entire episode to the things you want to hear about most. And we're kind of doing that a little bit today, too, because we got a lot of great feedback from our interview last week with Payne, founder of Patriotic Millionaires. So much so that we invited her back this week to discuss some of your comments and questions. Erica has a very clear way of explaining complicated tax issues, which is informed by all the practical, on-the-ground political work she has done over her decades lobbying for ordinary people in the halls of Congress. I will be leading her through that discussion. Then to close out the program, Ralph has some choice words about what he calls the outrages, the criminality, the cruel and vicious nature of this Trump regime and his alliance with Elon Musk's operatives. As always, somewhere in between, we will throw it to our tireless corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, let's have a little roundtable discussion sparked by your listener questions. Okay, Ralph, here's a listener question. The listener says, my question is about the 1980 Staggers Rail Act, which you apparently supported to deregulate the railroad industry. And he references a report. And he says it references that Ralph Nader's study group report on Interstate Commerce Commission and Transportation, the Staggers Rail Act, spectacularly backfired on shippers, travelers, the public, and the environment. What was your role supporting the Staggers Rail Act, and how did such a result occur despite your involvement?
That's a very good question. We were trying to eliminate price fixing of railroad tariffs. They would meet in secret with government officials and fix the tariffs for railroad freight, for example. In moving against this kind of cartel, government-sponsored cartel, we always cautioned that there had to be a companion drive to enforce the antitrust laws and the consumer laws, and that did not happen. They allowed merger after merger in airlines, trucking companies, and railroads, and that's what we have today.
But he said it's spectacularly backfired. Do you agree with that?
Well, it didn't backfire. It was a good thing to do, but the government undermined it under corporate lobbying pressures. So let's say we didn't do it, and they continued to fix prices, meeting in a Washington hotel with members of the Interstate Commerce Commission. Would they have continued to merge? Yes. Would they have continued to gouge their customers? Yes. And they would have added fixing the tariffs. So it would have happened to anyone. Unfortunately, we tried to fight the good fight on these other grounds, antitrust. We didn't get enough support from the organized public or the Congress. So the way to answer the question is all the things that led to what he calls the backfire would have happened anyway. It would have either happened with fixed tariffs, fixed prices, or it would have happened without it.
By the way, that question I neglected to say came from Robinson Foster. Thank you for that question, Robinson.
This one comes to us from the Netherlands. Albert Bosch. Dear Ralph, I would like to submit the following question for your show. What needs to change in the political system or even the Constitution of the United States in order to prevent ever again what is currently happening under and by the Trump administration? Keep up the good work. Kind regards from Amsterdam.
Well, one thing is to have a constitutional amendment that includes controlling corporations. The corporation, the company, those words are never mentioned in the Constitution. It only deals with persons. So then the corporate lawyers, starting with the Supreme Court case in the 1880s, decided to redefine persons to include corporations, which are not persons, they're artificial entities. And that was off to the races in terms of the corporate takeover of our political economy and our elected representatives. So we have to fundamentally in our Constitution address corporate power and its adjuncts like artificial intelligence, lobbying, money in campaigns. And that's got to be done around what we supported years ago, which is federal chartering of large corporations. We can't leave it up to Delaware and Nevada for their sweetheart chartering laws. We've got to revise the compact between the American people and the corporate entities that they allow to be created under obsolete laws of Delaware and Nevada and other race to the bottom states, as the lawyers call it. And third, we've got to make sure that corporations never have equal rights with human beings because they have immunities, privileges, amassing huge wealth, control of technology, governments, labor, capital that not even multi-billionaires can approximate as individual human beings.
This is from Amana in Ireland. Dear Ralph, why has America proved to be a zealous and willing host of racist, divisive ideology?
Well, it's not only a host of racist ideology, it's also a place where there is a civil rights movement after the abolition of slavery that grew up to try to counter it. Our tradition of slavery, which presumably ended with the Civil War, but was extended less viciously but still cruelly in the Jim Crow era, always had a countervailing force dedicated to equal justice under the law. And we thought with the civil rights laws of the 1960s, Lyndon Johnson as president, getting it through Congress, that we've turned the corner. But we found out that the racists are very creative, and they're not just sheriffs in southern states. Corporations can be racist, labor unions can be racist, school districts can be racist, politicians can be racist, and they redefine it. And it's very clever the way it's been redefined in our contemporary times. They don't use the old racist language. They use dog whistles, the kind of rhetoric that comes out of Trump's mouth, for example. So here we are back again facing this kind of destructive division, masquerading as race, but also part of class discrimination. And that's why I like the book by Bishop William Barber, who now teaches at Yale, who wrote a book called White Poverty, a way of his saying we have to pay attention to class because class exploitation fosters racial and gender exploitation. Of course, we know that from the days of slavery, right? The plantation owners' class fostered slavery for their profits. So read the book, White Poverty, and get ready for another countervailing, progressive, humane movement, which we must anticipate coming over the horizon once the darkness of the Trump years is behind us.
This one comes to us from GP. What were the provisions of Biden's border and immigration bipartisan bill that Trump did not want? Why do all the Republicans act like clapping, barking seals for Netanyahu and his Gen-I omnicidal slaughter of non-combatant civilians? When Trump refuses to obey, comply, honor his oath to obey and protect the Constitution of the United States, what does enforcement look like? When he pouts no, who has the distinct honor of cuffing him and frog marching the corpus out to the van?
Well, that's a huge cornucopia of questions can be resolved by saying we have to move to impeach him in the House and remove him in the Senate. Because in immigration, he's violating asylum laws, for example. He's violating due process of rights. He is setting up detention centers that are euphemisms for emerging concentration camps, separating children from parents. As far as Gaza, he's violating the UN Charter, which is a treaty we belong to. He's violating 6 federal statutes that say you don't give arms to foreign countries who violate such human rights principles as Netanyahu's doing with his genocidal mass murder, hundreds of thousands of Palestinian civilians. Again, an impeachable offense. So we don't need to get into the weeds here. The facts are really overwhelming in both areas that questioner mentioned. There was a rally at Columbia University recently by students, Palestinian Americans, Jewish Americans, all kinds of other backgrounds united. And the chant was the following: 400,000 dead, and you're arresting us instead? That has to win a prize if we ever had an Academy Award for civic shout-outs. 400,000 dead, and you're arresting us instead? Harassing students and faculty and others on campuses for opposing genocide, opposing international crimes, opposing violation of the U.S. Constitution and federal laws. Instead, they say it's anti-Semitism against Jewish Americans. Larry Summers said this, the former president of Harvard. The president of Harvard mentioned anti-Semitism, and Trump attacked Harvard saying they weren't paying attention to anti-Semitism without defining it and without giving any examples. It's not Jewish Americans on campus who are being expelled, beat up, harassed, cursed, suspended, stripped of their diplomas. It's the people who are protesting a mass criminality that we are co-belligerents with, weaponizing without any conditions, violating federal laws, the mass murderer, Netanyahu, who is the leading anti-Semite in the world against Palestinian Semites. He wants to wipe them out, and those who survive, he wants to expel from Gaza. You can't get much worse than that. And he's starting the same process in the Palestinian West Bank. In Harper's Index of Harper's Magazine, March 2025, they reported a survey in Gaza where 49% of the kids said they wanted to die, and 96% of the kids said they would be killed. They expected to be killed. That's the massive damage to the survivors of that Palestinian Holocaust.
So, Ralph, this next question comes to us from Paul Koulas. They say, howdy, Ralph. You've talked about the coffee party. I agree. In fact, I even started a website. Well done, Paul. What would the coffee party's agenda be? How's this? 1, a good paying job, good education, good and affordable housing. 2, clean and healthy environment, clean air, food, and water. 3, Medicare for all. 4, the open web. 5, free speech. 6, publicly funded elections. 7, freedom from unfair competition and monopolies. 8, economic protection during sickness, accident, old age, or unemployment. 9, Department of Peace. And 10, legalize marijuana.
Well, I'd go with the first 9, but I'd put fighting climate violence and pandemics as number 10 instead of legalizing marijuana. It's not that I'm against legalizing and regulating marijuana. More and more is being discovered about the harms of marijuana, by the way. But I wouldn't put that as number 10 and exclude what I just mentioned. But very good, generally. That's exactly the kind of civic leadership we want from the grassroots.
Very good. Now, this next question comes from San Francisco, Linda Swanson. It says, recently, the House and Armed Services Committee chair sent a letter to the Pentagon telling Hegseth he could not withdraw U.S. generalship role from NATO forces, which is a 75-year history. She said they did this, not White House or Congress or some other entity. Does this mean other chairs could write to agencies and say, you may not dissolve DOE or you may not move agency out of D.C., etc.?
The chairs of committee are subordinate to the whole House and the whole Senate. So it would have to be a vote in the House and the Senate. But chairs of committees can have standing to sue the federal agencies or the executive branch officials who are trying to abolish unlawfully or refuse to enforce systematically federal agencies and federal laws, respectively. And that's very important because the Supreme Court wouldn't allow a senator or representative to file suit in court to enforce congressional statutes. They say they have no standing. But in one case, they agreed that if a committee, a House or Senate committee, wanted to sue for those purposes, they would have legal standing and could proceed with their lawsuit and not have it dismissed.
This comes to us from Roger in Maine. Hi, Ralph. Is there a way that state or local government can take over and fund a private nonprofit hospital that is scheduled to be closed? It was announced on March 13th, 2025, that Northern Light Inland Hospital in Waterville, Maine, would be closing its doors to patient care on May 27th. It has been open since 1943 as an osteopathic hospital. It is the only hospital with inpatient services in Waterville, Maine, home to Colby College and Thomas College.
Well, the town can basically replace it with a town-owned hospital or encourage the formation of a cooperative hospital, which can get loans from the National Cooperative Bank in Washington, which we helped to create through Congress during the Carter administration. So they could do either one. They couldn't take it over as a nonprofit without, substantial legal maneuvers. It's much better if it's going to close to replace it rather than to try to take it over with its debts and other complexities.
This is from Carol Christie, who says, "My sister is a real Trumper. She said my nephew should sign up for Social Security at 62 before the immigrants take all the money. Is this true, and why does the right-wing media say this?"
It's not true at all. Social Security is very secure. If it starts needing replenishment, it can raise the cap on wealthier people and assess them for Social Security. Right now, the first $170,000 or so is subject to Social Security tax. But if you make $1 million, $10 million, you don't have to pay up to that level Social Security tax. And second, immigrants, I don't know what she means by immigrants. If they're undocumented and they have a job, they are paying into Social Security and may never get any benefits later on. They're not exempted at all from not paying into Social Security.
Hello, Ralph. Many thanks for your show. Hoping what we are experiencing now will fade and there will be opportunity to build back a better government. I am really tired of the Supreme Court being held hostage by politics. Would a much expanded Supreme Court, would 21 be too many, rotate judges for various cases to eliminate so much political bias? The court hasn't done us any favors with Citizens United, giving Trump carte blanche on shady behavior. Best wishes, Sharon.
Well, pick your choice here. Some people say 12 members of the court, 15. I haven't heard 21. Some people think that the justices should be term limited, 12 years or so. Some people think that they should be elected. You'd have to have a lot of campaign finance reform to allow that to be classified as a reform. I favor term limits. I think 12 or 16 years is plenty. I also wouldn't mind seeing 12 justices. I don't think 9 gives enough responsiveness to political change, especially since they're confirmed by the Senate for life. You have to have a turnover. I would favor at least 12 justices and have them term limited.
You don't think it needs to be an odd number?
Yeah, sorry, but 13 is a bad number.
So we'll do 11. Let's just something. We give it an odd number with 13.
Yeah, it could be 11. It could be 13 if you're not superstitious, or it could be 15. We do need a turnover.
Ralph, what about combining all of those options and doing a vastly expanded Supreme Court, like 21 or whatever the suggestion was, and randomly picking them like a jury pool? So you assemble 9 for each case, but there's a bigger pool and they get randomly selected.
You mean from the telephone directory?
I mean, couldn't do much worse. But no, having 21 Supreme Court justices and
but not all of them deciding on the same.
Yeah, not all of them work on each case.
Oh, I see. You have a rotation, you mean?
Yeah, or a some sort of selection, like like they're getting selected for, instead of jury duty, it's Supreme Court judge duty.
Right. Well, that didn't work out very well for the people opposing Trump in South Florida with the Trumpian seizure of national security materials from the White House that he took to Mar-a-Lago, because they have a rotation. And for some reason, the 2 Trump cases in the federal court down there ended up rotating into the offices of Judge Cannon. And you know how she turned out. So I said to myself, the laws of probability are strange indeed, but 2 cases and 2 random rotations, you ended up with the same pro-Trump judge. So it invites greater thought, Hannah.
How dare you pop my balloon of whimsy with your evidence?
I mean, she couldn't have been more prejudiced, right? I mean, she dismissed the case finally.
Well,
And she would have been overruled by the circuit court, definitely. But then, he won the election.
She said the special counsel was unconstitutional.
Yeah, I mean, the most raw rogue judge you could imagine on the federal district court.
She did what she was placed there for, I guess.
And the Justice Department under Biden never demanded her recusal. Another feeble attempt to try to control the rise, again, of a tyrant Trump.
But Chuck Schumer is sending a very strongly worded letter.
Yeah.
What about expanding the number of representatives in the House of Representatives, considering like the average, it's like 700,000 constituents per member? Hasn't our population increased more that we should have more members of the House of Representatives?
I've never been impressed by that. I think corruption transcends the numerical levels of legislators. They can all be corrupted regardless of their number if the system doesn't change beneath them. By the way, you'd have to build new buildings. There's no space.
Thank you for your questions, listeners. Keep them coming. It's best if they are short and to the point without long preambles. That's the most effective way to get us to read them on the air. To submit your question, go to ralphnaderradiohour.com. When we come back, I'm going to speak to Erica Payne of Patriotic Millionaires, who rejoins us to respond to your comments about her interview last week. But now, since corporate crime never sleeps, we're going to take a short break and check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, May 9, 2025. I'm Russell Mokhiber. Credit Suisse Services AG pled guilty last week and was sentenced for conspiring to hide more than $4 billion from the IRS in at least 475 offshore accounts. The company will pay more than $510 million in penalties, restitution, forfeiture, and fines. The guilty plea by the Swiss corporation is the result of a years-long investigation by U.S. law enforcement to uncover financial fraud and abuse. In addition to the plea, Credit Suisse Services AG entered into a non-prosecution agreement in connection with U.S. accounts booked at Credit Suisse Singapore.
Thank
For
you,
the Corporate
Russell.
Crime
Welcome
Reporter,
back to
I'm
the
Russell
Ralph Nader
Mokhiber.
Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan. We had a lot of enthusiastic response to our interview last week with Erica Payne, founder of Patriotic Millionaires. Patriotic Millionaires' latest project is America 250, the money agenda. It's a framework they've devised to permanently stabilize the economic lives of working people, stimulate widespread economic growth, and ensure prosperity and stability for America's next 250 years. The interview engendered a lot of discussion, including one listener touting Erica Payne for president. So we have invited Erica back on the program, not to announce her candidacy, but to respond to some of the comments left on our Substack site, many of which are pretty erudite. But first, let me introduce Erica again. Erica Payne is the founder and president of Patriotic Millionaires, an organization of high net worth individuals that aims to restructure America's political economy to suit the needs of all Americans. Their work includes advocacy for a highly progressive tax system, a livable minimum wage, and equal political representation for all citizens. She's the co-author with Morris Pearl of Tax the Rich, How Lies, Loopholes, and Lobbyists Make the Rich Even Richer. Welcome back so soon to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Erica Payne.
Thanks so much, Steve. Happy to be here.
Now, we opened the show last week with a quote from Erica, who was speaking at an IMF conference, and I'm going to quote her here. She said, "We have to facilitate an international conversation about what is enough. And if there is a number that is enough, there is a number that is too much. We believe that money becomes power, and when power threatens your democracy, you have to take away power. And the only way to take away that power is by taking away the money. And the only way to take away the money is taxation." So obviously, there are all kinds of taxes that our listeners commented on, and we open with a comment about the estate tax. And Erica, if you'll respond to this. This comes from listener Richard Bartholomew, who wrote, "The best way to tax the rich and save Social Security is to raise the estate tax and eliminate the tax loopholes that led Gary Cohn to say only morons pay the estate tax. I believe he was Trump's first Treasury Secretary. In 2001, my mother's estate was one of the 2.2% of estates that paid an estate tax. In 2023, less than 0.1% of estates paid an estate tax. Trump and the Republicans now intend to use reconciliation to repeal the estate tax. So basically what he's saying is that this is hardly paid by anybody, and if we had people actually pay this, this would save Social Security.
Okay, so I think we should back up a step, because what your listener has done, which I love, is he said that this, the moment when money moves from one generation to another, that's the time to tax it. So then you're not creating intergenerational wealth and you're not creating dynasties.
Right.
So I totally agree with that sentiment. The question is then, what is the best mechanism through which to tax that transfer of assets? So we've talked internally here at the Patriotic Millionaires about the estate tax. It has been such a thing. They spent tons and tons of money pushing this idea of the death tax. They really branded that, and that death tax marketing, I think, was incredibly successful. So we're in a situation, Steve, where the estate tax exemption during the Reagan years was around the equivalent around $600,000 today in the 80s. The rate was in the 60-70%. Today, you have an exemption on the estate tax of like 12 some odd $13 million per person, 25 some odd million. So you can see the exemptions have taken a huge bite out of the estate tax anyway. Then the rate has gone down substantially. I think it's at like 40 some odd percent now. So we've already cut away at it. Then you've added the loopholes to it. And as you said, only fools pay the estate tax. So I think the question is not, do we need to fix the estate tax? The question is, what is the best, most defensible mechanism through which you can tax the transfer of wealth from one generation to the other in order to protect American democracy from dynastic wealth that is sufficient that you find somebody 5 generations from now, Elon Musk's kid, is spending as much money on these elections as their great-great-great-great-granddaddy is. So that's the problem that we're trying to solve. Now, from my point of view, and I appreciate that people have different ones, from my point of view, this death tax messaging has been successful. I have friends of mine who are working class people who are upset about them paying the death tax. And what I try to tell them is that they do not have enough money to pay the death tax.
Right.
They will never pay it. They can't seem to get it. And so when you talk about taxing someone after death, as the right wing has done for years and years, this was a very deliberate strategy. I think you got to concede that they won. They've taken it down so much. There are so many loopholes. It really doesn't do what it was supposed to do. And I do think that the right wing was successful in creating a narrative framework around the idea of an estate tax that leads a lot of average people who are just thinking about it not in favor of an estate tax. And so that's the problem that I'm trying to overcome. So we suggest a couple of things. One is rich people hide their money in trusts, which is largely why you can't get the money out in an estate tax. And there are 9,000 million loopholes in trusts. Trusts are a very important vehicle. So if you have a disabled kid, for example, and you're worried about you dying while your kid is still going to need care, you can set up a trust in order to take care of your kid. It is an important vehicle. The issue is that the trusts have been so abused and riddled with loopholes. People are not paying the estate tax. They're putting their stuff in trust, and even that does not work. So we have a senior tax counsel who I'm happy to have come on the show sometime to go into more detail than I can go into, not being a trained tax lawyer as our tax advisor is. They just worked with Patty Murray and a couple of other senators to introduce a whole swath of reforms to the trust system. So that's an important thing to do. A second important thing to do is to just introduce the concept that maybe you don't have to just do this when the wealth is transferred from one generation to another. Let's just have a wealth tax. Okay, so that's the simplest way to do it. Do it while everybody's alive. Because I do think the messaging around taxing some person after that they've been dead as though they're a victim, it does something in people's heads, even though I can't think of a better time to tax people than when they're dead, because I, for one, don't plan on noticing any of the taxes coming out of my dead estate. Okay. But the easier way, I think, to get the public on board and with that public will to actually get real actual change made would be to take the concept of an estate tax and turn it into an inheritance tax so that you're actually taxing inheritance. And I believe you should tax inheritance exactly the same as you tax other income. So if I'm working and I make income, or I have capital gains and I have income, or I have an inheritance and I have income, all of those things from the point of view of this organization should be taxed the same. I think it's whether your reader agrees that we should concede this battle or not.
Right.
I, for one, having been involved in this battle for more than a decade, I think that we lost the battle of the estate tax. And I think that is okay. And it's okay to admit. And an inheritance tax, when you're talking about taxing heirs and heiresses, that is really something I think the public can understand, that you will have much less of an ability to have a big marketing campaign against. So I think that that's the more efficient way to do it, in conjunction with a whole bunch of trust reforms, which are probably a level of detail that would put everybody on this call asleep if they had to hear them. But suffice it to say, we just introduced a really good bill to do that.
So you're saying that it's at this point, it's politically unpalatable. Probably
It takes too much of a lift, Steve. It's too much of a lift. I mean, they have beaten the ever-living crap out of this death tax idea for the better part of 2 decades. And they won the narrative war. I think that's it. They won the narrative war. I mean, the estate tax is from 600,000 to several million. The rates are from 70% to 40%. It's over. And so let's do an inheritance tax instead. I can go and sell the heck out of an inheritance tax, and I think anybody else could too. It doesn't make sense for rich people's kids to get all kinds of free money and not even get taxed on it when other people are getting taxed because they're going to work in a quarry every day. Okay.
Great. Well, thank you for that. And thank you for that comment, Richard. This next one is on the topic of payroll versus income tax. And it was addressed to Ralph, and says, Ralph, I am a loyal listener and a fan, but I think you missed the boat in your recent Erica Payne interview by failing to make the distinction between payroll taxes, SSI and Medicare, and income taxes. Most low and middle class wage earners pay for more in FICA than in income taxes, particularly if you consider employer contributions. This is the most regressive of income taxes, not imposed on investment income, not on earned income over $175,000. Most wage earning people do not understand the difference between payroll and income taxes, and consequently do not understand how grossly regressive the U.S. tax system actually is. Does Ms. Payne's program address this disparity? You'd be doing a public service to educate listeners on this issue.
So first of all, huge thank you to the listener for writing in. This is such an important point. And if I could change, I have a few baseline things that I think could pop open this whole exercise. And one is to stop calling payroll taxes payroll taxes. So if I could encourage, anybody who wants to make some reform to stop calling payroll taxes and to quit referring to them as FICA, because everybody thinks that there's something else. Okay. In our proposal is a cost of living tax exemption, and it exempts taxes up to the cost of living, and it shifts the revenues to incomes over $1 million. That's the proposal. All we are doing with this proposal is moving income taxes. We are not moving payroll taxes. And the reason we're not moving payroll taxes, which I think should actually just be called social insurance contributions. That's what we should call them. They are social insurance contributions. They are to take care of you if you are disabled or elderly, Social Security and Medicare.
It's pension and health.
Yeah. And I think it is appropriate to have people contribute to those from the beginning of their working life. I don't look at those as regressive taxes in the way that a sales tax is a regressive tax. And for your listeners who don't know, regressive tax basically means that the poor people are going to feel it more than the rich people. And so we can go into a whole concept about that. But we don't eliminate payroll taxes in our proposal, and we don't do it for a very simple reason, which is we want to maintain the solvency of the Social Security system. We want more people paying into it. And when they passed these things, they knew that everybody needed a little skin in the game, and that having that skin in the game was what was going to help make those programs last forever. And you see the attack on Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid that has been going on for multiple decades here in the country. And they can be successful. I don't think that we should give them the opening of eliminating payroll taxes. I don't philosophically agree with that. What I do think we should do is start calling income taxes for incomes over $1 million excess income taxes. So we should have excess income surtaxes, leave payroll taxes alone, and eliminate the income tax up to the cost of living.
Thank you for that. By the way, I forgot to mention that question came from Robert Rath from Marietta, Georgia. So thank you for that, Robert. Now we're going to move into a slightly different topic, monetary theory. And one of our regular listeners, who's very erudite and leaves very detailed comments just about every week, and we're grateful for that, goes by the moniker Classic. And Classic says, the segment with Payne started out very well. And he or she quotes you, says, how the left likes to look at taxes is how you get money to pay for stuff. And getting money to pay for stuff is the purpose of taxes on the state and local level. On the federal level, we approach taxes very differently. We say concentrated wealth is the threat to democracy, unquote. Classic says, excellent. That's what I've been saying in the comment sections here at Ralph Nader Radio Hour for months, for years now. Unfortunately, this excellent start was entirely contradicted, however, by, and you excuse me, balderdash from Payne, which is completely centered on federal taxation being a source of revenue for the federal government to facilitate spending. Payne may have convinced herself that they are approaching taxation from some kind of novel perspective, but the Patriotic Millionaires are entirely approaching taxation from a right-wing monetarist perspective, one which contradicts any end goal of restoring or maintaining democracy. So that's quite an indictment there, Erica. How would you respond to that?
So first of all, I absolutely appreciate the comment. And having talked about taxes in an industry with people who talk about it in an entirely different way than we do every single minute, it just gets a little jinky sometimes, Steve. I mean, that's the easiest way I can say it. We approach the issue of federal taxation from an issue of a concentration of wealth and democracy preservation. That is how the organization approaches this. And that government spending is a separate item. The federal government, because we're the reserve currency for a lot of other reasons, there's not a dollar in, dollar out the way there is in state and local government. So if you want to get your trash collected and you want that done on a local level, those taxes are collected and they can collect that trash up to the point that they've collected the taxes. The federal government doesn't work that way. What your writer is referring to is modern monetary theory. The proponent of modern monetary theory, is probably the most famous one, is Stephanie Kelton, who we recently had speak at our How to Beat the Oligarchs conference. You can see her remarks on our website if you go to patrioticmillionaires.org. We also had Stephanie speak about 5 years ago when we did our first conference, Tax the Rich. And her topic was why we don't have to and still must tax the rich. And she talks about the fact that if you buy into modern monetary theory, you don't have to tax people for the revenue. The issue that in talking about it is that literally every single other person in Washington, D.C. talks about federal revenues. And there does come a point where you're talking with them and you have to be able to get into their language. And so I would just say, yes, I probably sometimes kind of flip over into the area that is not really why we're taxing people, because the conversation around revenues is the only conversation that anyone in Washington ever has. And the conversation that's happening in Washington at this exact moment is that lawmakers are busy cutting with Doge and Elon Musk and Republicans in office. They're trying to cut as much of the federal government as possible so that they can justify tax cuts for billionaires. I don't care if they cut anything, they still need to tax billionaires. And I don't think that they need to cut anything, and they could add some things. And I don't think they have to tax billionaires in order to do that. But I can see that sometimes I do go between the two concepts, almost in part because everyone is talking about the language of revenues. And we need to be in the conversation with them and meet them where they are while we're explaining to them that the real reason for taxation is democracy protection. So I definitely listen, Steve. I take the edit. I take the feedback. I think it's important for me to always be really focused on what we're trying to do here, which is to mitigate the threat to our democracy through taxation. But we do have a big revenue conversation happening in Washington. And so, I think I fell victim to that. So
But it sounds like another narrative issue. If everybody is talking one language and you have to kind of, this modern monetary theory is a whole nother language that you're trying to teach them to understand, it's a hard way to get through to people. Is that what you're saying?
Well, and also, I mean, here's the thing. Our members don't all buy into modern monetary theory. I just think it's something that people should know about. But leave modern monetary theory aside. The fact is the federal government does not in a dollar in, dollar out situation. And the reason that we need to tax people on the federal level is to prevent them from having so much wealth that it concentrates and threatens our democracy. So I can be very clear about that. While in Washington, they have a budget conversation that markup starts next week on, which is how are they going to cover the revenue cost of the federal government. You do have to have some tax revenues. You just don't have to have a dollar for dollar. So I like to look at it more as how much tax revenue do we need to finance the investments we make? Finance is a different word than pay for. You do have to have some revenues to finance the things that you need, but you don't have to have those revenues to directly pay dollar for dollar for them. And it just gets a little confusing when you're talking to people who are talking in a different language.
Right.
And here's the thing, the left has really bought into this pay for thing. I mean, these politicians love to talk about the pay for. They're going to close this loophole to pay for this one specific thing, close this loophole to do the other thing. We've never thought that this was a good idea because all it gets into is an argument about how much money you should spend and whether somebody is deserving of spending it. And our members do not take any position on spending. That's the other thing. Our members don't think that millionaires should have any more ability to tell the federal government what to spend money on than anybody else has. Now, they certainly have as many opinions as anybody else has, but none of their organization work goes to telling people how to spend the federal government. What our members are focused on is that making sure that the people get what the people need, that the people's elected representatives make the investments in our society that should be made. And to the extent that tax revenues are necessary to finance those investments, our members want to make sure that our members and people like them pay the vast majority of that necessary revenue for financing.
Right. Right.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. But most of us understand that using the household analogy, we've got to tighten our belts.
And the household analogy is a really stupid analogy. And it's actually a particularly stupid analogy when it comes to the federal government, because the federal government, because we are the reserve currency, and this is too easy of a way to talk about it, but it is the way to kind of help people understand it. If you have the ability to make additional dollars, you can make the decision to make additional dollars when other people do not have any money to spend. And so the federal government is actually supposed to be a counter-cyclical investor. So actually, when regular people, when human beings are needing to tighten their belt, that is exactly when the federal government should come in and spend money in order to stimulate the economy. So the idea of austerity, this is what austerity is. It's saying, I have a starving person. The best way to make them starve less is to give them less food today so that we will have more food for tomorrow. That doesn't actually work. Austerity applied at a federal level to a society that is in distress does the exact opposite of what the proponents of austerity are saying it should do. The tightening of the belt actually cuts off the circulation of the society. So it is exactly the opposite of what one should do. And that adds the question, if people are promoting austerity, who are the people promoting austerity? And why are they promoting austerity? Do they really believe that if you cut funding for everything that people need when your society is in distress, cut funding for healthcare, cut funding for food stamps, cut funding for public investment, cut the government so it has fewer jobs, all of those cuts just make the society weaker at exactly the point when it's already weak. The federal government should be coming in to prop up the society when the society is weak because of recessions or whatever other external factors. So the austerity police are not actually trying to save money and get the ship in order. What they're trying to do is get the ship weaker so they can steal all the crap off the ship. That's all it is.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
This is idiotic. Let me tell you, this Doge thing, I'm going to give you one reason why you can absolutely know that Doge has nothing to do with government efficiency. Doge went in and cut the one part of the federal government that brings in the money, the IRS. So if you are really going for government efficiency, if you are going for efficiency in your business, would you cut your accounts receivable department? The answer is no.
Right.
So this was never actually about cutting government. What it is about is breaking government, underfunding government sufficiently so it doesn't work at all. So people get so ticked off at government that they say, forget it, I don't want any of it. When what you really need to do is make it so when you call Social Security, somebody picks up the phone and helps your 87-year-old mother through whatever thing she's going through. Instead of telling your 87-year-old mother to find an internet cafe somewhere to go on the internet to go do whatever, because so many 87-year-olds are so tech savvy. I mean, give me a flipping break. This is like absurdity. Okay.
Yeah.
That's not government efficiency. It's trying to make people lose faith in government, which was a parallel track for all of these last 60 years. If you make something not work, you will make people hate it. And if you underfund it so it's not capable of doing its job, for example, FAA, what is going on with all of these flights? Does anybody really want to fly right now? Do you really think the best way to keep the skies safe is to fire air traffic controllers and have them work on computer systems that are older than my mother? No, that is not efficiency. It is idiocy.
Yeah. Well, and it's the same thing with the goal is to then privatize. Say government doesn't work, so we're going to do it. That's Medicare Advantage. That's the post office, those kind of things.
That's right.
Yes. All right. Now let's going to move into the area of minimum wage, which was one of the aspects of your plan that was very enlightening about raising it. Now there's kind of a contra minimum wage comment here from our friend Classic, who says Payne's approach to stabilizing the country through an increased minimum wage is short-sighted. I agree that it is important for workers to earn a livable wage, but Payne's methods are not congruent with the nature of labor in current times. Maybe it would have been appropriate in the 1950s when labor was generally working normal wage-earning jobs, but such is not the case today in the gig economy. Employers have learned how to circumvent labor laws and present it as something favorable for labor. With that, merely implementing an increased minimum wage is hardly sufficient to stabilize the national economy. Instead, the focus should be on implementing a national job guarantee program where the federal government guarantees a job to anyone wanting one at a minimally livable wage, with the intent that people in the job guarantee program will transfer into regular employment rather than stay in the JG program. How does that sound to you?
Well, this is, again, one of these issues where I feel like I share the same values of some of the things the folks who are writing in saying. I've just been in the bowels of this industry for decades, and I know how these things work, and I have the same conversation with the people who want a universal basic income. I mean, I want people to be taken care of. And I think the easiest way is for them to have the money that they need to make the decisions that they need to make about how they want to spend that money. And the easiest, most efficient way to deliver that money to them is through the jobs that they have. Now, should we at some point in the future, particularly with how AI and automation and all of that is going, are we going to eventually need, probably first a job guarantee and then a universal basic income? Probably. But why on earth do you think that somebody's going to pass either a universal basic income or a job guarantee when we can't even get people who are making hundreds of millions of dollars off the back of working people? We can't even get them to pay the working people. Strategy is knowing what door to open first so that you gain enough power and momentum to open the next door and the door after that and the door after that. It is absolutely true that people are moving to gig economy work. And it's also true that a lot of people really like gig work. We need to make sure the gig work pays enough that a person can support themselves. But we also, right now, again, I think this first step will be to take the people who are employed as employees and to guarantee that they make enough money to support themselves. That's the first step. Then the second step after that, say we start with the $1 billion companies. Then we go to the $500 million companies. Then we, keep on expanding that pool And then you go down, and then once you sweep through all of that and all of the jobs are paying a wage that somebody can live on, then you can actually look at your economy and say, what's the economy not covering? Right now, we can't even figure out what the businesses are capable of covering in terms of taking care of the people who work for them, because the wage laws are so bad that the labor can be exploited even in a profitable business climate. So what we first have to do is adjust that. We have to say, okay, how much can the businesses sustain of the people working in the economy? Then after that, you say, okay, what's left and what do we need to do about those people? And so my first step would be to implement a cost of living wage for employees. The second step would be to apply that basic math to a gig worker, which means you need to add on Social Security and some other pieces. So say that the living wage for an employee is 21 bucks an hour. Maybe the living wage for a gig employee, when you take in all of those different factors, that should be $30 an hour. That's just a math calculation. That's fine. Then you get all of the people who are working, who are making money for businesses and just not making a sufficient portion of the proceeds of that business. That's the problem. Businesses are making money. Human beings are not making money. That's the first problem we need to solve. Where the businesses are making money, the people who work for them need to make money. The amount of money they need to make needs to be at least equivalent to what it costs to support themselves. Then you move to the gig economy. Then you say, here are all of these people who business can't take care of. What are we going to do with them? Maybe it's first a job guarantee and then a universal basic income after that. But we don't know the answer to the question because we don't know how many people are just not making enough money because they work for businesses that don't have to pay them and have monopoly power. I mean, all of these different factors. Or is there something in some businesses where the business itself is necessary to the society, but the business can't survive? In which case, then the government should say, do I want to subsidize those workers or do I want to subsidize the business? If the business itself is important, but it can't be profitable except for through human exploitation, how do you mitigate the human exploitation? I think that's a conversation people should have. But we need to start with, if a company is making money, they need to pay the people who are making them the money something they can live on.
Well, on that note, Erica, I want to thank you for coming back and responding to our listener comments.
All right. Thanks, Steve.
That is Erica Payne of Patriotic Millionaires. We will link to their work at RalphNaderRadioHour.com. And talking about Doge and austerity and efficiency is a good segue for our final segment. Ralph?
I want to really bring home the outrages, the criminality, the cruel and vicious nature of this Trump regime and his alliance with Elon Musk's operatives by referring to something that a medical school professor at the University of Pittsburgh, Alexander Sunderman, did very recently. He picked 1 week of the Federal Health and Human Services Department layoffs by Trump, all of which would only save 0.1% of this department's budget, by the way. He took these and aggregated them. And so I'm going to share them with the listeners. Starts out, are you a parent? CDC's pregnancy risk assessment monitoring system was eliminated. This team collected data from states to understand pregnancy complications and reduce infant deaths. If you've received prenatal health guidance, this program probably informed it. It was eliminated. Next, work in a job with possible toxic exposures? NIOSH, the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, lost over 800 employees due to Trump fired. These teams monitored toxic exposures and other job-related illnesses and injuries were eliminated. Know somebody affected by addiction, suicide? This program cut staff supporting state opiate overdose and suicide surveillance programs. Take prescription medication? Food and Drug Administration Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, they just lost over 800 employees, including those who review new drugs, monitor side effects, and update safety labels. Worried about injuries, asthma, lead poisoning, or gun violence? The Centers for Disease Control was forced to cut teams working on injury prevention, environmental health, and national data systems. Had a dentist appointment recently. The National Institute of Dental and Craniofacial Research was required to eliminate its education and outreach division, which promoted childhood oral health and prevention. Need help with utility bills or emergency support? Trump fired the entire staff of this little agency. Entire staff. This program helped low-income families keep the lights on and the heat on. Do you care about tobacco prevention and cessation? Well, the Center for Disease Control's tobacco control program was gutted by Trump and Musk, pausing or suspending key efforts to reduce smoking-related deaths. Value government openness? The Center for Disease Control Freedom of Information Office was eliminated entirely by Trump, Musk, cutting off public access to health data and records. End quote. All of this in just 1 week, in early April. Listeners, how do you describe this? As deliberate collective homicide against the American people, as cruel and vicious mindsets that defined the term sociopath to include Trump and Musk, and a total indifference to the rules of law and our Constitution while they install a corrupt, corporate-dominated fascist dictatorship that puts at risk all Americans, red state, blue state, conservative, liberal. 1 week. It's only going to get worse before the American people rise up. And with a massive collective demand, you're fired, Trump, you're fired, Musk, followed by massive support of accelerated impeachment in the House and removal in the Senate of Donald J. Trump.
Thank you for that, Ralph. I want to thank our listeners for their questions. Keep them coming. And I also want to thank Erica Payne for responding to your feedback. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up, featuring Francesco DeSantis with In Case You Haven't Heard. A transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Substack site soon after the episode is posted.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt, Hannah Feldman, and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, listeners.
Oh, you've been sitting way too long. Oh, step up. You know what's right and you know what's wrong. Rise up.